The single father, Jake, was no stranger to hardship. Every morning began the same way. A shrill alarm breaking through the cold dawn light, pulling him out of the few hours of sleep he managed to snatch between shifts. He lay there for a moment, feeling the weight of the day pressing down on his chest. His body ached from yesterday's labor, his mind already racing through the long list of things he needed to do. Rent was due next week, and he barely had enough to make it. The electric bill was threatening to cut off his lights. His car, a beat-up old sedan that rattled with every mile, was one breakdown away from leaving him stranded. But none of that could slow him down. He had kids to feed. Jake's life had changed dramatically 3 years ago when his wife passed away. Her illness had drained their savings, and after the funeral, he was left alone to care for their 2 young children, Mia and Alex. He had no choice but to become both mother and father overnight. The weight of responsibility was relentless, and every day was a new battle between making ends meet and being there for his children. His love for them was boundless, but it didn't change the fact that he often felt like he was barely holding things together. His days began before sunrise. He'd wake up, pack lunches for his kids, and try to get them dressed and ready for school without losing his patience. The mornings were always a blur, his mind preoccupied with how he would juggle the 2 part-time jobs he held just to scrape by. After dropping the kids at school, he headed straight to the first job at a construction site. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid enough to keep food on the table. The hours dragged on, each one filled with physical exhaustion. He worked hard, sometimes wondering if his body would give out before he ever saw the fruits of his labor, but he had no other options. By the time Jake finished his first shift, there was barely time to catch his breath before rushing to his second job, delivering packages for a local courier service. The pay was meager, the hours long, and the work thankless, but Jake couldn't afford to be picky. He drove his old car through the city, navigating traffic, all the while thinking about what kind of dinner he could afford to make for Mia and Alex that night. He often found himself at the grocery store, calculating every cent as he filled the basket. There were too many times when he had to tell his kids no when they asked for something extra, a snack, a toy, something small. The disappointment in their eyes haunted him, but he couldn't let them see how much it hurt. He wanted to give them the world, but it felt like the world was always just out of reach. It was one such night when everything changed. Jake had just finished a grueling day, his body heavy with fatigue. He stood in line at the grocery store, his cart filled with the basics: milk, bread, pasta, and a few cans of vegetables. Behind him, a well-dressed man placed a few items on the conveyor belt. Jake didn't pay much attention at first. His mind was elsewhere, calculating how much longer he had before he had to pick up the kids from their after-school program. When he reached the cashier, the total came up a few dollars higher than he expected. He fumbled with his wallet, realizing he didn't have enough cash on hand. Embarrassed, he was about to put a couple of items back when the man behind him stepped forward. "Let me get that for you," the stranger said, pulling out a crisp bill and handing it to the cashier before Jake could protest. Jake blinked in surprise, shaking his head. "I can't let you do that," he mumbled, feeling the weight of his pride. But the man smiled, waving off the refusal. "It's just a few bucks. Don't worry about it." Jake, though grateful, felt an odd mix of emotions. It wasn't just the money, it was the reminder of how close to the edge he was living. After thanking the man, he quickly gathered his bags and left, his mind still lingering on the act of kindness. The next day, as fate would have it, Jake ran into the same man. This time, it was outside the school where Jake was picking up his kids. The man was there with a young girl about Mia's age. They exchanged polite nods, but before Jake could walk away, the man spoke again. "We keep running into each other," he said with a friendly smile. "I'm Andrew." Jake introduced himself, feeling slightly awkward. He wasn't used to talking to strangers, especially ones who seemed to have their lives so perfectly together. Andrew glanced at Jake's old car, then back at him. "You work construction, right? I've seen you around." Jake nodded. "Yeah, and some other jobs here and there." There was a brief pause before Andrew spoke again, his tone curious but non-judgmental. "How do you manage it all?" Jake let out a small, tired laugh. "I don't have much of a choice. It's just what I gotta do." Andrew nodded, his expression thoughtful. He seemed to be studying Jake, as if seeing something more than just a tired man in work boots and a worn-out jacket. "You ever think about doing something different?" Andrew asked. Jake shrugged. "I've thought about it, but with 2 kids and bills piling up, it's hard to take any chances." Andrew seemed to weigh his words carefully before speaking again. "I might have an opportunity for you. It's a little different, but I think you'd be good at it." Jake looked at him, skeptical. "What kind of opportunity?" Andrew smiled, but there was a hint of something deeper in his eyes. "Come by my office tomorrow. Let's talk. I think I can help." Jake was taken aback. He didn't know this man, didn't understand why he was offering to help. The last few years had taught him to be wary of offers that seemed too good to be true. But something about Andrew's calm confidence made Jake curious. The next day, despite his reservations, Jake showed up at the address Andrew had given him. It was a sleek office building downtown, the kind of place Jake would never have stepped foot in under normal circumstances. He felt out of place in his work clothes, his boots heavy on the polished floors. Andrew greeted him warmly, leading him into a spacious office with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city. Jake felt a pang of discomfort. This world was so far removed from his own. It was almost surreal. They sat down, and Andrew began to explain the offer. It wasn't a job in construction or deliveries. It was something completely different, a chance to work directly with Andrew, learning the ropes of his business. Andrew ran several companies, and he needed someone he could trust to manage things at a more personal level. "I don't have any experience in that kind of work," Jake said, feeling out of his depth. Andrew nodded. "I know, but I'm not looking for experience. I'm looking for someone who's resilient, someone who knows how to work hard and problem solve on the fly. I see that in you." Jake was silent for a moment, unsure of what to say. Part of him wanted to jump at the opportunity. It sounded like a way out of the never-ending grind he'd been trapped in for years, but another part of him was skeptical. Why would a man like Andrew want to help someone like him? As if reading his mind, Andrew leaned forward, his tone sincere. "I know this sounds unconventional, but I've learned that sometimes the best people aren't the ones with the right degrees or the most polished resumes. They're the ones who've been through the hardest battles and come out stronger. That's why I'm offering you this chance." Jake looked at him, searching for any hint of deception, but all he saw was honesty. Still, the decision wasn't easy. Taking this job meant leaving behind the security of what he knew, even if what he knew was barely enough. It meant risking something new, and that scared him. But it also meant a chance, a real chance to change his life. And for the sake of his kids, Jake knew he couldn't let fear hold him back. "I'll do it," he said, his voice steady. Andrew smiled, extending his hand. "Welcome aboard." Jake shook his hand, still unsure of what the future held, but feeling, for the first time in years, a glimmer of hope. Jake's first day at Andrew's company was nothing like he'd imagined. The polished marble floors of the office building gleamed under the fluorescent lights. Everything seemed to sparkle with a kind of sophistication that made him feel out of place from the moment he walked through the doors. He'd dressed as best as he could manage, borrowed a blazer from a neighbor, and wore the one pair of slacks that hadn't yet developed holes from years of wear. But even with his attempt to look professional, Jake felt like a fish out of water. Andrew's company wasn't just a single business, it was an empire. Various departments handled everything from real estate investments to tech startups. It was a world that was not only foreign but almost incomprehensible to Jake, who had spent most of his adult life doing manual labor. He'd expected to be thrown into something more hands-on, but instead, Andrew introduced him to a small team of executives who were handling the expansion of one of his newest ventures. Jake's role wasn't clear to him yet, and the scope of the projects they discussed flew over his head. Words like scalability, ROI, and market penetration were thrown around casually, and Jake did his best to keep up, but every conversation made him feel like he was drowning in jargon. He spent most of the first few days observing, trying to learn how these people communicated, how decisions were made, and how deals came together. It was a whirlwind of high-level discussions, numbers, and complex strategies. Every now and then, Andrew would check in on him, offering encouragement with a calm smile. "You're doing great," Andrew would say, as if sensing Jake's growing self-doubt. But inside, Jake felt like an outsider in this world of wealth and power. He wasn't sure what Andrew saw in him, or how he could possibly live up to whatever expectations had led to this job offer. The pressure gnawed at him constantly. To make matters worse, the other employees, many of them wearing expensive suits, talking in polished tones, and walking with the confident air of people who had been born into privilege, kept their distance. Jake could sense the silent judgment. He wasn't one of them, and they knew it. There were moments when they'd exchange glances during meetings or make subtle comments that reminded him just how far out of his element he was. The first time Jake had to present his thoughts in a team meeting, his nerves were shot. Andrew had asked him to come up with a simple strategy for a project. Nothing too high stakes, but for Jake it felt like everything was riding on it. He stood at the front of the room, his hands shaking slightly as he held a piece of paper with his notes. The faces staring back at him were a mixture of impatience and curiosity. I think we should maybe focus on, Jake stumbled over his words, trying to recall the business terms he'd heard the others use. His throat felt tight, and his palms were slick with sweat. The more he tried to speak, the more self-conscious he became. His mind went blank, and he stood there, frozen for what felt like an eternity. Finally, Andrew stepped in. "It's okay, Jake. Take your time." But it didn't help. The moment had passed. Jake muttered a few more words before rushing through the rest of the presentation, his face burning with embarrassment. He could hear the quiet whispers behind him as he returned to his seat, head bowed. That night, after putting Mia and Alex to bed, Jake sat at the kitchen table, his head in his hands. The weight of the day, of all the days leading up to this moment, pressed down on him like a crushing force. What was he doing here? What had made him think he could succeed in a world so far removed from his own? Every part of him wanted to give up, to walk away from this uncomfortable, unfamiliar life. He was failing, and worse, he felt like he was failing his kids. They had sacrificed so much, and now it seemed like he was chasing a dream that wasn't even meant for him. But something kept him going. The thought of returning to his old life, working grueling hours at the construction site, picking up shifts as a delivery driver, barely scraping by, it was unbearable. He couldn't go back to that. For his kids, he needed to push through. He needed to find a way to make this work. The next day, Andrew called Jake into his office, his tone warm but serious. "I know things haven't been easy for you so far," Andrew said, leaning back in his leather chair, hands folded thoughtfully. "But you're here for a reason, Jake. I didn't bring you in because I expected you to know everything right away. I brought you in because you've got something most people in this world don't: grit, real-life experience, and the ability to handle pressure. That's what I need." Jake looked at Andrew, feeling a mix of gratitude and frustration. "I just feel like I'm in over my head. I don't know how to do what these other guys do." Andrew nodded slowly, considering his response. "I didn't expect you to, but that's what makes you different. You're not one of these guys who's had everything handed to them. You fought for everything you have. That kind of perspective is rare in this business. It's what's going to make you invaluable here. But you have to believe that. Jake left the office feeling slightly better, but the doubts still lingered. Over the next few weeks, Andrew took a more hands-on approach, mentoring Jake personally. They worked side by side, with Andrew explaining everything from the basics of business strategy to how to read financial reports. Slowly, Jake began to grasp the concepts that had once felt so foreign. He wasn't an expert by any means, but he was learning, and more importantly, he was beginning to see how his own experiences could apply to this new world. One afternoon, Andrew handed Jake a small project that would test his ability to apply what he had learned. It wasn't a massive deal, just a local real estate investment, but it was important enough to the company that Jake felt the pressure. For days, he pored over the details, running numbers, consulting with team members, and studying similar past projects. Every night after his kids were asleep, Jake stayed up late, determined to get it right. The day of the final review, Jake presented his findings to Andrew. His heart pounded in his chest as he spoke, but this time he didn't fumble. He was clear and concise, explaining the potential risks and rewards of the investment. When he finished, there was a moment of silence as Andrew looked over the documents. Finally, Andrew smiled. "This is solid work, Jake. You've got a good instinct for this." The words felt like a validation Jake hadn't even realized he needed. For the first time, he felt like he could really do this. That maybe Andrew hadn't been wrong to believe in him. The sense of pride he felt wasn't just for himself, but for what this could mean for his family. He wasn't just surviving anymore, he was building something, creating a future that went beyond just getting by. But it wasn't long before Jake faced another challenge, one that hit much closer to home. As he became more involved in the business, his time with Mia and Alex began to suffer. The long hours meant missing dinner some nights, and occasionally, when he got home late, his kids were already in bed. The guilt gnawed at him. He had taken this job to provide a better life for his children, but it was coming at the cost of time with them, time they couldn't get back. One night, after a particularly long day, Jake came home to find Mia waiting for him at the kitchen table, her eyes puffy from crying. "Dad, you promised you'd come to my recital," she whispered, her voice trembling. Jake's heart sank. He had completely forgotten. The recital had been on his calendar, but an important meeting had run late, and by the time he'd remembered, it was too late. "I'm so sorry, sweetheart," Jake said, kneeling in front of her, guilt flooding his chest. "I got caught up with work." Mia looked at him, her disappointment palpable. "You're always at work." Jake swallowed hard. She wasn't wrong. He had been so focused on proving himself at the company, on making a better life for them, that he hadn't realized how much he was missing. The next day, he walked into Andrew's office, his mind racing. "I don't know if I can do this," Jake said, sitting heavily in the chair. "I'm trying to be there for my kids, but this job, it's pulling me away from them." Andrew listened, his expression thoughtful. "You're right to think about your kids first. But remember, part of why you're doing this is for them too. You're building something that can give them a future you never had. But if you need to adjust, if you need more balance, we can make that happen." Jake looked at Andrew, surprised. "You'd do that?" Andrew nodded. "Family comes first. I didn't realize how hard it would be for you to balance everything, and that's on me. Let's figure out how to make this work, for your family and for your career." It was a turning point for Jake. He realized then that success wasn't just about making money or climbing the corporate ladder. It was about finding balance, about creating a life where he could be there for his kids and still build something meaningful for their future. From that day forward, things began to shift. Andrew helped Jake set clearer boundaries with his work, allowing him to manage his time more effectively. And while Jake still had moments of doubt and challenges to overcome, he had found his footing, not just in the business world, but in his life as a father too. Andrew had always been something of an enigma. From the moment Jake started working for him, there was a calm but powerful presence about the man that intrigued him. Andrew was wealthy beyond measure, running multiple successful businesses. But he never flaunted his wealth. He wasn't the kind of man who barked orders or demanded attention. Instead, he moved through life with an understated confidence, treating everyone with a quiet respect that only those truly comfortable in their own skin possess. For the longest time, Jake had assumed that Andrew's success came from his sharp business mind and relentless work ethic. But as the weeks turned into months, Jake started to notice something deeper about Andrew. A subtle layer of complexity that hinted at an internal struggle Jake couldn't quite put his finger on. Andrew had a way of watching people, as if he was searching for something beyond the surface. He often asked Jake questions that seemed personal, not just about work, but about life in general. "Why do you keep pushing so hard?" Andrew asked one evening as they worked late in the office. The question took Jake by surprise. Andrew wasn't referring to his job, but to the way Jake approached everything, as if failure wasn't an option, as if he carried the weight of the world on his shoulders. Jake shrugged, unsure how to respond. "I don't know. I guess I don't have much of a choice. If I don't push, everything falls apart." Andrew leaned back in his chair, studying Jake with a thoughtful expression. "I used to think the same thing," he said quietly. "That if I didn't keep striving, keep pushing for more, everything would slip away. But after a while I started to wonder, what's the point if you lose yourself in the process?" Jake frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" Andrew sighed, rubbing the back of his neck as if he were choosing his words carefully. "I spent most of my life chasing success, building these businesses, making deals, expanding my empire, and I did it. I got everything I thought I wanted. But along the way, I realized something was missing. I lost people. I lost time with my family. I lost connections. And for what? More money? More power?" Jake listened intently, sensing that Andrew was revealing something personal, something rare. It wasn't often that someone like Andrew opened up, especially about regrets. "I have everything I could ever need," Andrew continued, gesturing to the large office around him. "But sometimes I wonder if I have anything that really matters." The weight of Andrew's words hung in the air. For Jake, this was a revelation. He had always viewed Andrew's success as the pinnacle of what he could achieve, something to strive for, a life free from the struggles he faced daily. But here was Andrew, the man who had it all, admitting that maybe, just maybe, the life Jake envied wasn't as fulfilling as it seemed. It was during one of their long conversations that Andrew asked Jake about his late wife. "Tell me about her," Andrew said one evening after they had wrapped up work. His voice was gentle, his expression open. Jake hesitated, caught off guard by the question. He didn't talk about his wife often. It was still too raw, too painful. But something in Andrew's demeanor made him feel safe, like he could open up without judgment. "Her name was Sarah," Jake began, his voice soft. "She was everything to me. We met when we were young, and we built a life together. She was strong, stronger than me, I think. When she got sick, she fought hard, but it wasn't enough." Andrew nodded, listening carefully. "How did you cope?" Jake looked down, his hands fidgeting in his lap. "I didn't, really. I just survived. For the kids. They needed me, so I did what I had to do. But it's been hard." There was a long pause as Andrew absorbed Jake's words. Then, almost as if he were speaking to himself, Andrew said, "It's strange, isn't it? How we spend so much time building these lives, and then in the end, it's the people we love who define whether or not we've lived well. Not the money, not the success." Jake nodded, the truth of that statement settling deep in his bones. He had always known that on some level, his children were his reason for everything. But hearing it from someone like Andrew, who had seemingly achieved everything society told him to value, made it all the more powerful. As the weeks passed, Andrew began to share more of his own story, revealing the layers beneath the polished exterior. He told Jake about his father, a ruthless businessman who had driven Andrew to pursue success at all costs. Andrew had followed in his father's footsteps, determined to prove himself, to be the best. But as the years went on, Andrew found that no matter how much he achieved, it never felt like enough. "My father used to say that success is measured by the size of your empire," Andrew said one day. "But I've started to wonder if it's measured by something else entirely." Jake could see the shift in Andrew, a quiet transformation that mirrored his own. For Andrew, the single father's perseverance, his ability to keep going despite the odds, had ignited something in him. He saw in Jake a kind of strength that Andrew felt he had lost long ago. A strength born not from ambition, but from necessity, from love. One afternoon, after another long discussion, Andrew made a decision that would change everything. He asked Jake to stay late, closing the door behind him as they sat across from one another in the quiet office. "No. I've been thinking a lot about what you've shared with me," Andrew began, his voice calm but firm. "And I've realized something. You've taught me more than I ever expected." Jake frowned, unsure of what Andrew meant. "You see, Jake, when I offered you this job, I thought I was helping you. I thought I was giving you a chance to succeed in a way you never could before. But the truth is, you've helped me more than I've helped you." Jake was about to protest, but Andrew raised a hand to stop him. "I've spent my whole life chasing the wrong things. I thought that if I just worked hard enough, if I built something big enough, I'd finally feel like I'd made it. But watching you, seeing how you fight for your family, how you keep going even when everything is against you, it's made me realize that I've been missing the point." Jake sat in stunned silence, absorbing Andrew's words. "I've learned more from you in these past few months than I have from any business deal or negotiation. You've shown me what real success looks like, what it means to care about something bigger than yourself, to love, to sacrifice." Andrew leaned forward, his eyes sincere. "And I want to make sure you know that. I want to offer you more than just a job. I want to give you a partnership." Jake's heart skipped a beat. "A partnership?" Andrew nodded. "You've earned it. You have the kind of perspective and integrity that this company needs, and I believe that together we can build something even greater, not just in terms of profit but in terms of purpose." Jake was speechless. The offer was beyond anything he could have ever imagined. He had come from nothing, struggling to survive day by day, and now here he was, being offered a chance to shape the future of a company, to create something meaningful, not just for himself, but for his children. But before Jake could respond, Andrew added one final thought. "This isn't just about business, Jake. It's about life. I want to make sure that whatever we build, we do it with the right priorities, that we don't lose sight of what matters most." It was then that Jake truly understood. Andrew wasn't just offering him a partnership in the company, he was offering him a chance to build a life that was balanced, meaningful, and full of purpose. Andrew had seen in Jake what Jake had often overlooked in himself: resilience, strength, and the ability to care deeply for the people who mattered most. In that moment, Jake knew that this wasn't just about making more money or rising higher in the corporate world. It was about creating a life that was fulfilling on all levels. A life where he could be there for his kids, where he could make a difference not just in business, but in the lives of others. And as Jake shook Andrew's hand, sealing the partnership, he felt a sense of peace that he hadn't known in years. The struggle wasn't over, but now, for the first time, he had hope. Not just for a better life, but for a future that truly mattered. In the weeks that followed, Jake's life began to change in ways he hadn't anticipated. The partnership with Andrew was more than just a financial opportunity. It was a chance to grow in ways he hadn't thought possible. He was no longer the struggling single father who barely made it through the day. He was building something real, something lasting. But perhaps the most important thing Jake learned was that success wasn't just about wealth or status. It was about finding balance, about knowing when to push forward and when to step back, about being there for the people who mattered most. And as he tucked his kids into bed each night, he knew that no matter how far he had come, the real measure of his success would always be in their smiles, their laughter, and the love that had carried them through even the darkest days. The day Andrew made his life-altering decision began like any other, unassuming and routine. Jake arrived at the office with a renewed sense of purpose. He had found his rhythm at the company, no longer feeling like the outsider who didn't belong. Over time, the projects he worked on gained traction, and the business strategies he helped develop were yielding impressive results. But as much as his professional life had flourished, the lessons he'd learned about balance, family, and purpose had grounded him. Andrew, however, had been increasingly reflective in the past few weeks. Though he still worked tirelessly, there was a growing sense of introspection in the way he conducted himself. He would spend long stretches in his office, staring out the large windows that overlooked the bustling city below. Jake often found Andrew deep in thought, almost as if something weighed on him that went beyond the usual demands of running a business empire. It was during one of these quiet moments that Andrew called Jake into his office. As Jake entered, he noticed an air of finality about Andrew. He wasn't the commanding figure who usually radiated confidence. Instead, he looked like a man standing on the precipice of an important decision. Andrew gestured for Jake to sit down, his voice calm but steady. "I've been thinking a lot about everything we've done," Andrew began. "The business, the projects, all the success. And I keep coming back to one thing: the future." Jake leaned forward, listening intently. He wasn't sure where Andrew was going with this, but the tone was different from their usual discussions. There was something personal about it, something that felt bigger than just business. Andrew continued, his gaze drifting toward the window for a moment before returning to Jake. "I've built this company from the ground up. For years, I poured everything I had into making it what it is today. But as I've told you before, Jake, there's a cost to that. A cost that I didn't fully understand until I saw how you live, how you balance your kids, your work, and your life." Jake shifted in his seat, still unsure of where this was leading. Andrew had been open about his regrets, about the sacrifices he'd made to achieve his level of success. But this felt different. "I've realized something," Andrew said softly. "I've built this empire, but I don't want it to define me anymore. I don't want my legacy to be about numbers and profits. I want it to be about people, about the impact we can make on their lives." Jake nodded, understanding the sentiment, but still puzzled. Andrew's gaze hardened slightly, his tone becoming more resolute. "I've decided to step back," Andrew said, and the words hung in the air like a bombshell. "Not just from the day-to-day operations, but from the business itself. It's time for me to focus on other things, on my family, on the relationships I've neglected for so long." Jake's mind raced. This wasn't just a small shift in priorities, this was monumental. Andrew, the man who had built an empire, was walking away from it. "I'm not leaving this company without direction, though," Andrew continued, his eyes now locked on Jake's. "I've thought about this a lot, and I know you're the one who can take it forward." Jake's heart skipped a beat. He blinked, unsure if he'd heard correctly. "Me?" he asked, incredulous. Andrew nodded. "Yes, you. You've proven yourself in every way, Jake, not just as a businessman, but as a leader, as someone who cares about people and understands what really matters. I trust you to carry this company into the future, to make it something even better than I could." Jake sat back in his chair, stunned. The weight of the offer was overwhelming. For so long, he had been trying to prove himself, to show that he belonged in this world of high stakes and big decisions. But he had never imagined that Andrew would hand him the keys to the kingdom. It was a responsibility that went far beyond anything Jake had prepared for. "I don't know if I can do this," Jake finally said, his voice quiet but honest. "This is your company, Andrew. You built it." Andrew smiled, a look of peace on his face. "That's exactly why I know you can do it. You understand what's important, Jake. You've been through more than most people can imagine, and you've come out stronger because of it. You have the heart and the integrity to make this company something that's about more than just success. It can be about changing lives." Jake's mind raced. He thought about his kids, about the life he had been building piece by piece. He thought about all the sacrifices he'd made, and all the times he doubted whether any of it was worth it. But now, sitting across from Andrew, he realized that this was the culmination of everything, every struggle, every setback, every hard-fought battle. This was his chance to create something bigger than himself, something that could provide for his children and make a difference in the world. "I'll do it," Jake said, his voice steady with determination. "I'll take the company forward." Andrew smiled, relief washing over his face. "I knew you would. And don't worry, you won't be alone. I'll still be around for guidance. But the future of this company is in your hands now." For the next few weeks, Jake transitioned into his new role. The shift was monumental. He wasn't just an employee anymore. He was at the helm of a vast organization. But with Andrew's support and guidance, Jake found his footing. He brought in new ideas, introduced programs that focused on employee well-being, and prioritized community engagement projects. He wanted to ensure that the company reflected the values he had come to hold dear: integrity, balance, and purpose. One of the first initiatives Jake introduced was a mentorship program for struggling families, inspired by his own journey. The program provided financial education, job training, and emotional support for single parents trying to rebuild their lives. It was Jake's way of giving back, of using the platform he had been given to help others who were walking the same difficult path he had once walked. Jake also made sure that he kept his work-life balance in check. He set strict boundaries for himself. No late-night meetings that would cause him to miss dinner with Mia and Alex. No weekend work that would steal time from the soccer games and school events he had promised to be a part of. He had learned the hard way that time with family was more precious than any deal or business success, and he wasn't willing to compromise that. As the company thrived under Jake's leadership, his personal life flourished too. He found joy in the little things, the laughter of his children, the quiet moments at home, the knowledge that he was finally building a life that wasn't just about surviving, but about truly living. The transformation was gradual but undeniable. Jake wasn't just the struggling single dad anymore. He was a leader, a mentor, a father who had managed to create a life filled with purpose and balance. And while the responsibilities of running a company were enormous, Jake carried them with a sense of humility and gratitude. One evening, months after Andrew had stepped back, Jake stood on the balcony of his home, looking out at the city skyline. Mia and Alex were inside, finishing their homework, and the sounds of their giggles floated through the open door. The weight of his journey hit him all at once. The struggles, the sacrifices, the moments of doubt and fear. But now, standing here, he felt a deep sense of peace. He hadn't just changed his life. He had changed the lives of his children. He had given them a future filled with possibilities, and that, more than anything, filled him with pride. He wasn't the man who had everything, but he was the man who had enough. Enough love, enough purpose, enough strength to keep moving forward. As Jake watched the sun set over the city, he thought about Andrew's words, about legacy, and what it meant to live a life that truly mattered. He knew now that success wasn't about the size of your bank account or the number of deals you closed. Success was about the people you loved, the difference you made, and the lessons you passed on. And as the darkness settled in, Jake smiled to himself, knowing that he had finally built something worth leaving behind, a legacy of resilience, compassion, and purpose. He had become the man his kids could look up to, and that was more than enough. In the end, both Andrew and Jake had discovered the same truth. Life was not measured by what you gained, but by what you gave. And for Jake, the greatest success of all was that he had built a life not just for himself, but for those he loved most.